Thanks for downloading this episode of Cork Talk with me, Tim Atkin. A weekly conversation with some of the most famous people in the world of wine. David Baverstock grew up in South Australia, but emigrated to Portugal for love and wine. He started out in the Douro Valley before moving to the more southerly Alentejo, where he now works for the Winestone Group. Our insightful chat covered his time in Beaujolais with Marcel Lapierre, Portugal's 250 indigenous grape varieties, how the country's wine scene has changed since he arrived in 1982, and what it's like playing tennis with Sir Cliff Richard. Hello, David, and welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, hi, Tim. Nice to be here. Just back from holidays, so a little bit rusty, but it sure go well.
But you're going to be relaxed, at least. You've got a tan, you're feeling relaxed, right?
Sure. No, it's been good. I'm pretty good on the beach. I go for runs and I swim a lot, so it's like my pre-vintage preparation time as well. Yeah.
When are you starting the harvest? Pretty soon.
We're starting on Monday, which is probably a week later than normal because we've had a pretty cool. We had very good winter rainfall. We had a cool spring, and even summer has only just started to kick in. So it should be good. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. I mean, I can see why you like the beach. You're an Australian, obviously people can hear from your voice. And you were born in Adelaide, weren't you, but brought up in the Barossa Valley. I know Barossa Valley is not on the coast, but it's not too far away, is it?
No, it was always there for weekends. In fact, Tim, just to sort of the record straight, my family, my dad was a bank manager, moved around the state quite a lot as I grew up. And luckily for me, his last posting was to Tanunda in the Barossa Valley. So I finished off my high school in Tanunda and just kind of fell into it after that. You know, I was in the Barossa, the Australian the wine industry was just starting to take off, and so yeah, it wasn't a family thing. It was just very lucky that I finished up in the Barossa at the right time.
But your parents were wine drinkers, presumably. If your dad had a bit of money, if he was a bank manager, so presumably he drank wine, did he? Was he a beer drinker?
Growing up in the 60s and 70s, they were much more. I mean, it was much more beer at that time. So later on they became pretty good wine drinkers. But looking back, we were much more a beer family than a wine family as I grew up.
How old were you when you arrived in Tanunda then? In your teens?
14, 15, something like that.
Yeah.
So
I mean, Tanunda's there's this kind of Barossa Deutsch tradition there, isn't there, with umpar bands and things like that. Is that still there?
Yeah. Oh, for sure, yeah. Barossa Vintage Festival, and there's a lot of German traditions in the Barossa, that's for sure.
And what made you want to study winemaking? Was it just that it was surrounding you when you were 14 years old?
It was just, I wasn't one of those kids that was, knew always what I wanted to do when I finished high school. So, enology, Roseworthy was nearby for a start, which was quite handy for me. And when I went over there and had a look at the place and found out what the curriculum was all about, it just more and more appealed to me as a profession that was pretty hands-on, practical, but not too routine. Every year is different, and I was lucky when I did the course. It all fell into place. I mean, I never sort of looked back, and it was always each 3 or 4 years that I did enology, it just got better and better as the course went on.
And what did it teach you? Anything useful looking back?
The course, Roseworthy?
Yeah.
It gave me a profession. It gave me a profession, which turned out to be pretty useful in the end. I think doing Roseworthy, if you look around at the other places where you can do enology, Roseworthy had their reputation of being very sort of hands-on. So I think that was good. It was it's since changed quite a bit. Roseworthy's been absorbed into the Adelaide University system, and it's become a little bit more academic than it used to be. I think we got the best of it. We got the sort of transition in when it was moving from practical, being very hands-on, and becoming a bit more academic. My year was a sort of a transition year when all that kind of thing was happening. But it was, I think that's, Australian winemakers have the reputation of being able to, flying winemakers can lob anywhere and then fix a pump or something. And we got a lot of that, which was handy.
And what was the Aussie wine industry like then? You said your parents were beer drinkers. Was it just switching from fortifieds to dry wines? I mean, the fortifieds were still bigger in the 70s, weren't they?
I think the fortified era sort of ended in the 50s and 60s, and the 70s, winemaking was starting to take off a bit. So, there was a lot of fortified wines being made, of course, at that time, but there was a big move, big shift into table wines during the 80s when I went back to start working in the industry. So when I was at Roseworthy, it was you considered a bit of a bit sort of radical. You hadn't sort of got you couldn't your grades weren't good enough to be a doctor or a dentist or something, or a lawyer. So
or a lawyer, yeah.
So we finished up as winemakers, but it was an exciting time because the industry hadn't taken off, and you felt that there was potential, and there were going to be jobs, and there was lots to do. So
your first job was at Saltram, I think, wasn't it? You were there 80 to 81 after you graduated?
80, 81 with the two vintages, so 2 years I had there, yeah. And Saltram was a fantastic place to work because it was one of the old Barossa iconic wineries that Peter Lehman had established, and Seagram's had just bought it. So I came back I'd been in Europe travelling, and I came back just at the time that Seagram's had taken over Saltram, and Peter Lehman left straight away and set up Peter Lehman Wines because he wasn't going to work for a multinational. But for me, it was ideal because, I needed the job, I needed the work. But the great thing about Saltram was they had vineyards in the Barossa Valley, Eden Valley. They brought up fruit from the Coonawarra, so it was Cabernet. There was Syrah from Matala in Langhorns Creek. But not only that, Seagram's got people like Len Evans on board to give us direction and things like that. Obviously Len Evans. So he organised that we got Chardonnay grapes or Chardonnay fruit from the Hunter Valley, and there was almost no Chardonnay in Australia. It's amazing to look back at that time. There was only Murray Toole had some Chardonnay, and Rothbury Estate had some Chardonnay, and Len being involved with Rothbury, we filled crushed Chardonnay grapes up in the Hunter Valley and refrigerated trucks brought the must down, and we started fermenting it the day after at Saltram in the Barossa Valley. It was awesome. It was amazing.
And what made you want to leave? Because you went to France in '82, didn't you? And Beaujolais in particular.
Well, so what happened? In the meantime, this is a fairly crucial part of the conversation. But I'd met and married a Portuguese girl, and she hadn't adapted as well as she hadn't adapted all that well to that Barossa Deutsch kind of culture in Tanunda.
She didn't like the umpire bands, right?
Some of that stuff didn't go down all that well. But Barossa was this is 40 odd years ago. You couldn't get an espresso coffee, and she'd come straight out of Lisbon, and she couldn't get a decent coffee in Tanunda, so we'd have to go down to Adelaide on the weekends. So it was more about I could see a couple of years I tried to make the best of what I could with Saltram and learn as much as I could and get as much experience, because I knew that it wasn't going to be a long-term thing about staying in Australia. And I was really happy about going back to Portugal. So when we talk about going back to France, it was to do a vintage in Beaujolais and then move on back to Portugal with her.
So you knew you were going back to Portugal, basically.
Yeah, it was en route. Yeah, I basically just did the vintage there because I was very lucky when I was at Saltram. I had a visit from Marcel Lapierre. I think he'd organised. He was with a couple of mates, and they were going around looking at wineries in the Barossa. And luckily, Saltram was on the list. So we hit it off sort of immediately. And I think I knew at that point that I was going to be over it, heading back to Europe for the following vintage. And we sort of teed it up that I would go and work there with him. So it just, again, one of those things that just kind of feel nice.
I mean, he was a fascinating guy. I met him a couple of times. I mean, he had quite radical ideas, didn't he, about the use of sulphur in particular, or the non-use of sulphur, basically.
The non-use of sulphur.
He was a natural winemaker, wasn't he? Ahead of his time.
Before his time. I can remember it was, you have to understand, Tim, it was a really crazy time for me because, I didn't speak French, and I'd come out of an Australian, especially vintage culture where it's all, 24-hour, 12-hour shifts, long hours and all that kind of stuff. It was like a party. The whole thing was like a party. He'd open fantastic wines every night. We had a chef from Lyon that cooked for us. we spent a lot of time in a cafe drinking pastis and things like that. But I do remember, obviously in the winery, he had the guy that you mentioned wasn't there, but he had one of his assistants, I think, who was
Jules
helping
Chauvet.
him.
Yeah.
What I do remember was that we used a bit of sulphur in the must, but then we'd pump over, which I thought was a bit strange because we were fermenting. It's carbonic maceration, it's a whole bunch fermentation, but we used to pump over, and the must was fairly clear to start with because of the sulphur, and then as it dissipated, the colour came back, and it was after that we would close the tanks down and let the carbonic maceration fermentation sort of take place. So that I can remember that, but the influence on me, you were asking about that, it was more it was more negative in the end, I think, because so many times I've been back and I've taken samples and I put them in the back of the car and drive, and the wines always turn out crook. I mean, they're always bad, because a little bit of sulphur, I think, wouldn't hurt, and filtration. I mean, a few of the basic things you need to do, but he gets away with it. I mean, the wines I've had his wines in the US, and somehow they keep relatively stable. But for all the winemaking that I've been doing over the last 30, 40 years, the instability factor of not using sulphur is just too great.
It's risky, isn't it? Was it there that you tasted this amazing Burgundy that you remember, the 78 Musigny from Comte Georges de Vauguier? Was that one of these parties one night after a day's work?
Well, I think it was. Yeah. But he always. There were a lot of people at these parties because all the pickers were there for dinner as well, and he'd take me aside and open a bottle. We'd have 3 or 4 of us that knew a bit about wine. So I remember we got the treatment, but probably because there hadn't been any Pinot. I hadn't tasted Pinot in Australia. There hadn't been any Pinot Noir. There was no Pinot Noir back in Australia back during my time at Roseworthy. I remember in part of the course we opened our enology class. We opened some bottles of Pinot, but they were usually quite old and not in good condition. And I was really unimpressed with Burgundy, red Burgundy, at that point. And this wine just kind of completely blew me away. I mean, it was just so polished and so sophisticated and so unlike Cab Shiraz and anything, which is the majority of sort of things that we'd had back in Australia at that time. So yeah, it really did blow me away.
And so you went from there doing a harvest to Portugal, which is where you've been ever since, basically.
Kicked off.
Amazing country. I absolutely love it. How did you get your first job? I mean, how did you start looking for a job as a winemaker? Did you speak some Portuguese because your wife was Portuguese?
No, look, there's a story within a story here. I had a job to work with a Madeira wine company, which had been set up while I was in Australia. I was supposed to come down to Portugal and go to Madeira and work for the Madeira wine company. And when I arrived after doing the vintage in France, which was sort of the end of that year in 81, I think, I guess it was, I thought I'd be going off to Madeira, and I rang the guy who'd set it up. He was the managing director of the Madeira wine company at the time. He said, "David, look, I'm really sorry. I didn't have the support of the board, and this job isn't going to happen now." And I hadn't bothered to learn Portuguese because I thought, living in Madeira, working for the Madeira wine company, I could get away with English. So I really was in strife. I mean, I was in a bad place there for a year or so. I got jobs working. I worked at Casa Aliança for a little while, and I worked for somebody else, just basically lab jobs. Just what it did, out of in a sink or swim situation, I learned Portuguese really, really quite quickly because I had to, just to sort of keep afloat. My first real job was with Croft, actually. After a year in Portugal of not really getting anywhere, we'd had our first child at that time. I didn't know. I was maybe considering, going back to Australia. Luckily, Croft were looking for a winemaker, and that was the big sort of positive move in my time at Portugal back then. We moved my wife from Lisbon. We moved up to Porto. I was with Croft for 2 years, and then I joined the Symingtons, and that was even more exciting because they were a bigger company, lots of things happening. So the port trade kind of was good for me in that it gave me that stability in my early years in Portugal. It gave me a solid job, and it had a reputation, and I knew a lot about fortifieds because
so you were fortified winemaker already, really?
Well, I'd made fortifieds at Saltram. I made Mr. Pickwick Port and things like that, But seriously, Tim, our wine course at Roseworthy, there was a big part of it was distillation and fortified, because it had been a big part of the Australian wine industry for so long. So I knew more about the mechanics and the chemistry, and I knew much more about spirit than the people I was working with. And it worked. It was great for me to be in the port trade at that time.
I mean, the Douro Valley, partly because of port, or mainly because of port, is probably the most famous wine region in Portugal. Well, what about the other regions? Are there others that have as much potential, even more potential, do you think, than the Douro Valley?
For making table wines?
Yeah.
Well, all the regions are different, and they have different grape varieties, so they have different styles of wine. So whether the Douro makes the best wine or the Alentejo makes the best wine, or Bairrada, I mean, I think they all make different wines based on different grape varieties and based on the climate that exists in those regions. I would stick my neck out and say I think the Douro table wines, red table wines, table wines are the best in the country. I think when they're really good, they are exceptional.
It's a very beautiful country, Portugal. It's quite small, isn't it? But how many wine regions does it have within it that we should know about? I mean, a dozen, maybe, would you say?
Well, probably a dozen, yeah. But the main ones would be Vinho Verde and the Douro Valley and the Douro and Bairrada and the Alentejo and the Algarve. I guess you throw that one in. And then there's the fringe areas like Beira Alto and Beira Baixo and bits and pieces here and there. But those six are the ones that really stand out.
And the closer you get to the Atlantic, the cooler it gets, generally speaking.
Of course, definitely. So even the Alentejo has a bit of a cool climate influence down that way. Portugal is pretty, but it's a very small country, but very diverse at the same time. There's mountain ranges up in the Douro. There's the Serra da Estrela around the Douro. There's Porto Alegre near the Alentejo, which has altitude. So there. Even though the Alentejo and some of the areas are threatened by climate change, for sure, there's no question about that. There are regions by the coast and regions with altitude where you can, escape from the heat a bit. Yeah.
Mm. And it's got this amazing fund of indigenous, inverted commas, grape varieties. And you've argued that no other country has this level of biodiversity. How many grape varieties does it have of its own? 200 plus, would we say? The number's meant to be 250, which is considerable. I mean, it depends now who you talk to. I mean, I think, there's some Eastern European countries who'd say they've got that many as well, and maybe Greece. Italy.
But it's certainly, for a small country, for the concentration of varieties per area is Portugal, I think, is kind of the biggest winner there.
And how did the biodiversity come about? Was just each region specialise in its own grapes? Was that happen?
There's a theory about, and it's sort of backed up by fossils from the Ice Age that show that there was Vitis vinifera varieties grown in Portugal before the Ice Age came through, and it didn't actually wipe out. It didn't wipe out the industry. There are pockets of Portugal where the Ice Age where it basically wiped out most of viticulture in Europe. But there are pockets of areas in Turkey and Portugal where the varieties didn't get eliminated, and so that's probably the basis of why there are still so many great varieties, because they never really. This is a theory that sort of came via SOGRAP through. They did a lot of study on this, and that's what they found. So and then later on there was a lot of trade between countries in the Mediterranean, but there was this initial pocket of grape varieties in Portugal that never were wiped out.
So some of those could be very ancient varieties. Do we know which is the oldest of the varieties?
I think Touriga Nacional is meant to be the oldest grape variety.
And an incredible grape. I mean,
that they have there. But there's a lot but there's some that we don't even know about yet. That's the thing. I mean, we only probably work with 20 or 30 across the whole country. So there's an enormous legacy there still to be discovered.
And which are Portugal's best varieties? You've mentioned Touriga Nacional, which is not as widely planted, I think, as it should be, not just in Portugal, but elsewhere as well. I mean, which other varieties do you think we should be looking out for?
Well, there's the other one, which is not related to Touriga Nacional, but it's called Touriga Franca, which is also, I think, is a better variety than Touriga Nacional, actually. We've got... of course, it's not ours. It's actually French as well. But Alicante Boucher is something that's done incredibly well in the Alentejo. So that's great. That's an exceptional variety there. We have Trincadeta. We have Aragonese, which is Tempranillo, which is Iberian, I guess you could say. So there's Then there's Jaén in the Dow, and there's Barga in Barada. The whites, I think, have been, a little bit underestimated over the years, and now we recognise that Alvarinhas is a fantastic variety from the north. You've got Laredo making really good Vinho Verde.
And Cruzado, maybe.
The whites are surprisingly. I think initially everybody went for the reds because it's probably easy to make good red without great conditions. It's much more difficult with the whites, and they've taken a bit longer to come around. But
and do they tend to work better on their own as varietal wines or blended? And was there a tradition of blending grapes? Field blends where people were blending everything together, or
well, yeah. I mean, you can traditionally the Portuguese have always defended blending. In the sense of blending grape varieties, but going way back. I mean, even in the Douro, particularly, they blended the grape varieties in the vineyard, which is a bit harder to defend. I mean, really, and in terms of modern viticulture, it's hard to defend that. But in fact, these old vineyards with low yields and a lot of intensity and concentration are hard. They're very hard to beat. So, but nobody these days sets out to plant vineyards. In terms of field blends, I mean,
as a field blend
from the past. Yeah. But I would certainly say that I think, in my experience working particularly at Esparral over the years, and in the Douro, that blending varieties, there are very few varieties that actually stand alone. Alicante Boucher is probably one that does, but the majority, you can, a little bit of tweaking with 3 or 4 varieties tends to give you a better result, I think.
And what about the non-indigenous varieties? You've mentioned Alicante Boucher, you've mentioned Aragonés, which is Tempranillo, a Spanish grape, essentially. Are there things that have worked well in Portugal from outside? Has Cabernet worked? Has Merlot worked? Syrah?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, Syrah's done super well. I mean, I did a lot of work with that at Esparral over the years, and it was always our premium red. But I used to blend it with Alicante Boucher. I think it helped Alicante Boucher quite a bit. But Syrah sort of has done really well. Not too many others, actually. I mean, Portugal they've been pretty good at focusing on their, keeping the originality of their own grape varieties. Apart from Syrah, there's a bit of Cab floating around, but not much. There's no Merlot, a bit of Merlot in there.
Chardonnay a bit, Sauvignon Blanc a bit, but not much.
There's some Sauvignon Blanc. There's some Sauvignon Blanc, and everybody that has it sells it. It doesn't matter. It's not. It doesn't matter whether it's New Zealand or where it comes from. I think these days Sauvignon Blanc just sells. But the Chardonnay, I don't think there's anything much particularly good in the way of Chardonnay. There's a few people doing it, but not. It doesn't. Happily, it's not doing well. So.
Well, I think it's good in a way. I mean, you mentioned you started out in the Douro Valley, Symingtons, Quinta de Cresto, etc., etc. Then you moved to Esparral. We've already mentioned Esparral in the Alentejo, and that was a real new frontier at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. It basically had a few cooperatives making wine, mass wine.
Like Regengus or places like that?
Regengus and Redondo and Borba. Yeah, and they made pretty decent because the cooperatives were pretty well set up because they knew they had to have, refrigeration and reasonably good hygiene. So they made fairly decent wine, but not. I mean, there was no barrel work and that kind of thing. Esparral sort of came along on a big scale, and it was perfect for me because at the time I was still with the Symingtons, but I got this call to go down and have a look at Esparral, and the scope of it was fantastic. They had 500 hectares of vineyard, modern winery, a lot of it underground, temperature control, good barrel work. So it was like, died and went to heaven kind of thing. It was just
sweet shop time. Yeah.
The perfect move. And it was a perfect move. And I had 30 amazing years there, and it was very true. The difference, obviously, the difference between the Douro and the Alentejo is the Douro is based on mountain viticulture, and everything's done by hand, and it's low yields, and the wines have to turn out, reasonably expensively. Whereas the Alentejo has economies of scale, machine harvesting, machine pruning, and irrigation, all the sort of things that were the new world. That is the new world of Portugal, really, is the Alentejo.
Mm. And to rolling hills, and pretty much, wasn't it? I mean, there's not many mountains down there, are there?
No, nothing like that. No, the Porto Alegre is the only the northern area of the Alentejo runs into Porto Alegre, where vineyards are 600-700 meters, which is good.
I mean, during that time, you also did a bit of consulting for various people, including good old Sir Cliff Richard at the Adega do Cantor, which is his project in the Algarve. I mean, what was it like working for a celeb? I mean, was that the first time he'd done that? I mean, Len Evans was a bit of a celeb, but he was a wine celeb. He wasn't the kind of global celeb in the same way that Sir Cliff is.
Yeah, no, it was. Well, it didn't. Unfortunately, there weren't any wild parties in the Mediterranean, and that would have been ideal. But that didn't never really happen. What we did, we played a lot of tennis. He's a good tennis player. Reasonably interested in wine, not fanatical about wine. So I think it was a nice kind of hobby for him to have. He had a lovely property in the Algarve, which he'd come over every vintage and like to get his hands dirty and play around with the ferments a little bit. It was good fun. It wasn't.
Did he sing to you or not?
No. But I was lucky. I did go. He gave quite a few concerts at different times in the Algarve. I think there was one where Albufeira was had it celebrating its 150th year or something like that, and he did a concert on the beach, and it was really quite magical. It was fantastic, and we were on boats, sort of looking into the bay, and I mean, he's a super nice bloke, and
he's a nice guy.
It was always a bit surreal being there, because I remember seeing, Summer Holiday and all the movies when I was a kid, and suddenly there he is, But we used to play doubles. I'd play with him, and he had his manager and somebody else and a professional down the other end, it was always good fun. The close calls always went our way, if you know what I mean.
So you were playing with him, were you?
Yeah.
Listen, in 2021, so 3 years ago, you joined Baverstock, which is where you are now. Just tell us about where it's based and the styles of wine that it makes, and what is Winestone? Because you're now part of this thing called the Winestone Group, and it sounds very grand.
Yeah. No, it's pretty amazing. I left Estoril for a quiet little job with Baverstock, and suddenly it's become it's exploded. It's a volcano. So Baverstock is in the northern part of the Alentejo, in a place called Ariolas. It's near Estremoz, if you remember that a little bit. It's a cooler part of the Alentejo, which appealed to me. Having spent all that time in a hotter part of the Alentejo, I increasingly think that with climate change, things are going to change, and Baverstock are very well situated in Ariolas. It's closer to the coast. It's in a more northerly area. Baverstock is owned by the Mello family, and the Mello family are one of the quite powerful Portuguese industrialist families. They've been very involved in fertilizers and chemicals over the years. Now they own most of the private hospitals in the country, and the stuff on the motorways, the tolls, and the road houses, and amongst a whole lot of other things. But they're a very wealthy family, and they invested in Baverstock maybe 30 years ago, and just basically sort of to have a place in the country, also sort of a family kind of thing for the weekends. They didn't really get excited about it until about 10 years ago. And they got in some good people to manage it, and it suddenly sort of took off. And because the results are really good with Baverstock, they decided to develop the portfolio, call it Winestone, and incorporate things like Quinta de Coto from the Douro, Teixeira, Passo de Teixeira, which is the Vinho Verde, There's Retiro Novo, which is Krone, part of Wiesenkrone. Wiesenkrone is a port company that Taylor's bought, and then Taylor's sold it to us. So that's a new project. And there's one more called Kinder dos Pancas, which is near Lisbon.
So you've got, 6 brands now altogether, have you? Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're back in the Douro, because Quinta de Couto is amazing property in the Douro. I mean, it made that wine Grande Escolha, didn't it? I mean, forgive my terrible Portuguese pronunciation, but that's one of the first Portuguese wines I ever bought to lay down. I mean,
yeah, and because it was in the Baixa Corgo, it was a cooler area, less alcohol. I think the family it's a good time to expand, but they picked the right kind of properties to buy. So Quinta de Couto has a great reputation, but it's sort of been fallen aside a little bit. The family that owned it weren't investing, and the wines maybe fell away. But it has a really good name, in Portugal. So with that one and Pancas and also the Krone port stuff, I think we've got a really, really good range now to work with.
Busy man then, if you're doing 6 properties.
My wife. She's not overly happy. We've got 3 grandkids now, Tim, as well. So I've got to find time for them as well. Plus a bit of tennis now and again.
Yeah, that's good to know. I mean, just as a little bit about looking back, you arrived in Portugal in 1982. That's an amazing history you've had there, and so many people have met you there. How's it changed as a winemaking country? I mean, when you got there, it wasn't even the EU. I think it joined the EU, or the EC as it probably was then, in 86. Yeah?
86.
Yeah. How has it developed, and how will it develop going forward, do you think? Can you look backwards and forwards for us?
It's tricky, because it seems to have gone in a flash, when you caught up in the way that I have. Well, I think the regions have become more established. People understand better now, and there weren't any winemakers as such when I first came over here. The first graduates were just coming out of Villarreal, so the knowledge was fairly weak. Viticulture the same. The money that came in from joining the European community helped a lot in developing wineries and vineyards. The winemakers have become much more confident. They're the equal of anywhere. They study in Australia or they study in the US. There's a much more confident feel about the wines in the industry and the people here now. I think also what's happened, which has helped a lot, is tourism. Portugal's become very, very, a very popular tourist spot. So that's helped the economy quite a lot. And whenever, the great thing about Portugal is the wine and food. And so people get involved in that and they take that back with them. So that's also going to help Portugal on the export side. But the local market is obviously hugely strong for us. And Brazil is the other big market, and I can't see that changing too much. I mean, it's a small country, very small country. It's not going to double its production in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. It'll grow a little bit, it'll grow slowly, but relying heavily always on the local market and the Brazilian market, and then a bit here and there, the UK and the US.
I mean, the wines should almost be better known, I think. I mean, I buy quite a bit of Portuguese wine, partly because it's great value. You can get some really good bottles of wine.
Yeah. That's the you never get let down by a Portuguese wine. It'd be nice to sort of maybe get some higher scores for some of the top wines and maybe a bit more credibility at the top end of the market. That's what they need to do a bit. But otherwise, I think it'll just kind of chug along. I imagine. I don't see anything radical. It's pretty hard to predict anything at the moment.
Isn't it? We're not going to know what's going to happen past November, really. Yeah, just tell us about climate change, because you've mentioned it, and you said obviously, it's hotting up, even though this vintage is a bit cooler. How is Portugal adapting? I mean, is it going to plant new varieties? Is it changing the way it farms? Are you changing stuff in the cellar? I mean, what can you do to mitigate the effect?
Well, it's pretty complicated. I mean, if you can see the heat, some of the areas. I mean, you can go towards the coast, as I said. You can go to the higher altitude vineyards. You can get around climate change that way. A lot of people experimenting with different varieties, but I don't know that there's anything that's come out of these sort of private collections and doing microvinification work. Things like Alentejo Beaujolais, being a red juice variety, a Tintoretto, that naturally is a good bet against climate change because it always holds its colour and acidity because it's a blended variety with the Petit Boucher stuff in. So that's a big that's a big help, that particular variety. Otherwise, we do a bit of spraying with. You might have heard about it. That happened in Australia. We spray some white clay mixture on the vineyards when there's a heat wave coming. So that helps to reflect the heat and keep the temperature down a little bit lower in the vineyard. It's it's just like us using sunscreen when we go to the beach. So we do that. That's becoming fairly normal part of viticulture these days.
Interesting,
especially in the south in Alentejo.
Mm. I've always wanted to ask you if there's anywhere else in the world you'd like to make wine. I know that bottle of Musigny kind of turned your head when you were a young man. Would you still like to go back and do something in Burgundy? I mean, you've been close in Beaujolais, and some people think Beaujolais is in Burgundy, but I don't think it is.
Yeah, the more you talk to people about making Pinot Noir, the more difficult you realise it is, and maybe it's a bit of a pipe dream, that one. No, I think I just enjoy the end product. I do like Syrah from the Rhone Valley, so I guess that would be quite fun to be involved in something there, and it's close to Lyon, which is a fantastic gastronomic city. There are parts of Australia that I particularly like Eden Valley. Even though I'm a sort of Barossa guy, I like Eden Valley a lot with those more elegant, Henschke style Syrahs from up there, and the Rieslings are fantastic. So there are, I think you get drawn back home at some point, and between Eden Valley, McLaren Vale, which is by the beach, or even Clare, all those places. Less so the Barossa because it's a little bit too close to home and a bit touristy maybe.
Would you ever move back, or are you Portuguese?
I can't see it happening unless maybe on a consultancy thing possibly, but I've got these grandkids coming along now, and I've got this big mega job now with Winestone, so I can't see it happening, Tim. No.
Yeah, and I think it's great that you've made your name in Portugal. Lots of people associate you with Portugal. You've done amazing work there. Why would you go back somewhere else, really?
Mm. Yeah. No, it's something you imagine would be nice to have it, but the reality of those flights are a killer.
I'm the same as you. Somebody said to me recently, "Do you want to come and give a speech in Melbourne?" I thought, I'd love to, but I just can't face the flight.
Yeah,
I just can't. Yeah. Or the jet lag when I come back, or the other end. Final question, just tell us how you get away from wine. You've mentioned playing tennis with Sir Cliff. I played tennis against you. I know you're a very good tennis player. How do you like to relax? You've got time to relax with the grandkids and this big job.
Yeah. Well, we've got a weekend. We managed to build a weekend place not far from Lisbon, just south of Lisbon, over the bridge, and it's got a swimming pool. So it's great. It's great to be on the weekends with the grandkids there. And I'm not that keen. I'm not promoting paddle, but I've started playing paddle. I much prefer tennis, but there's a paddle court near where we have this house now, so I started playing paddle. I'm doing Pilates because I need to maintain some flexibility and that kind of stuff. So I'm basically it's the grandkids, it's sport, and maybe a bit of TV on the weekends.
And this massive new job, right? Well, newish.
And the big job, but that's not what I'm relaxing.
It definitely isn't. Listen, David, it's been lovely to catch up with you. It's been too long, my friend.
Yeah, you too, Tim.
It's been too long.
Yeah, you bet. Well, how's your tennis these days?
I don't play. I play more golf these days. You'd whoop me.
I'll get round to golf soon too.
Brilliant. It's been lovely talking to you. I'll see you soon.
Yeah, you bet, mate. Cheers. Thanks. All the best.
Well, some great stories there. And what a wealth of knowledge. Next time on Cork Talk, after a 2-week holiday break, my guest will be olive oil expert Elizabeth Berger. Join me then. Thanks for listening to Cork Talk. If you want to read more reports, articles and tasting notes by me, go to my website, timatkin.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @TimAtkin and on Instagram @TimAtkinMW. See you next week.